So welcome back to Sikistan and welcome back to the next episode in this series of getting Hadyn to the British. So if you follow Hadyn on his YouTube, you'll have seen last week that he maxed out. So we kind of had a mid-cycle or halfway, a little bit earlier than halfway through his training block, we had a max out. So originally the plan wouldn't have been to max out at this stage, but because the competition got pushed out by 4 weeks, it was originally at the end of May, I think, and now it's the end of June. So we had a little bit of extra training time. And so kind of one of the things we try and talk about a lot with these, especially in powerlifting, but kind of all strength training sports, is that you need to be going to a destination and pushing through them and then kind of having distinct changes in training periods rather than just kind of a little bit of volume sometimes, a little bit of strength training. We talk about a lot of times people in powerlifting in particular will spend too much time in a strength training phase and not enough time to volume. So where you make the gains is volume and then you realize those gains in strength training, it's not vice versa. So with that extra training time, we didn't want to, and you couldn't really feasibly push for such a long time without a distinct change. So rather than going for something like the original plan would have been about 10 weeks of volume and then about 4 weeks of strength training and then kind of like a week and a half or 2 weeks of prepping, we ended up with something like a 20-week training block. So we peaked him at that was week 9, I think. We have a little deload at the end of this week, so the max was the start of this week. So essentially, we didn't peak him for this either. So we went, for example, in the squat, we went from 3x3, with the 3RM for 3 sets at 215, straight into the max the next week. So at the same time as trying to test and see where we were, we didn't want to also waste a training week peaking him for no good reason. So we kind of promptly changed or quickly moved through the progression. So what would have probably happened if the competition wasn't here was we would have moved through the progressions and then just reset without a max, kind of reset with the volume. So instead we just kind of added an extra week in the middle and then we went for Hadyn's 1RM. So for example in the squat, when we finished that 15 3x3, if we were peaking him we would have gone for something like 2x2 with 225, for example, but it's by and by, so we great results. So in the squat, he squatted 250, so that was a 20 kilo PB. I think it's 25 kilos since he started with us. Great technique in that. We're very happy with it. On the bench, he's benched 160 pause and then touch and go 165. So that is 15 kilos up in total since he started with us. And in the deadlift was probably the only place where we didn't realize the gains fully, I suppose, and what he was capable of. So we'll just start with the squat. So looking back on what we did right in the squat, I think in the squat and the bench, it'll be basically more of the same going forward. So for the squat, we put a lot of focus on his high bar squat and quad strength. So using belt squats, reverse lunges, you saw those quad Nordics. So Hadyn's quads were particularly weak compared to his glutes and his lower back, for example, and you can see that in his low bar squats. So his hips would routinely take over and lower back would his back angle would change fairly aggressively in some of his heavier low bar squats, which is something we didn't want. So we also wanted this guy over to sumo deadlift as well initially from the floor. So we really hammered these squats. We had 2 high bars a week, 1 belt squat a week, and then 1 low bar session, or sometimes we didn't even have a low bar session. So going forward, we'll be taking away the emphasis from his quads in terms of assistance, and the high bar would be included in those assistance. So we'll still have 1 high bar a week and probably 1 low bar a week.
Yeah, so as Gareth was saying, the emphasis is going to be to be kind of drawn towards the low bar. What that will look like when you're kind of watching the vlogs or when you're watching Hadyn's training, the low bar, like in the last few months, has just been basically practice. So movement practice, doing most of his training volume, putting most of his recovery capital into the high bar. Now what you're going to see is that kind of in reverse. So the low bar will take over. More of the volume, more of the higher intensity training will be done with the low bar. As Gareth said, there'll still be some high bar stuff in there. There'll still be working sets with the high bar, but the low bar will now get a lot more attention.
So moving on to the bench, we very happy with the progress. There was nothing in particular that was jumped out as that was incorrect or that needed to be massively adjusted. Obviously, we saw great bench gains. Probably would have seen a little bit more if we'd peaked, had an extra week of maybe a little bit more practice with, for example, 150 kilos. So originally he just had the week before, a few days beforehand, he had a couple of singles at 150. If he had another few days of practice with 1RMs with our heavy singles in the bench, we probably would have seen a little bit more than 165, maybe 170 touch and go. But again, we're very, very, very happy with that 165. One thing of note going forward is we didn't have access to a lot of dumbbells, and we didn't really prioritize any unilateral upper body work for his benching. But Hadyn mentioned in that video, if you watch it, one of his triceps was a little bit sore. So Hadyn's gyms in UK are opening from Monday this week, the 12th. So he'll have access to a lot more equipment. So we'll be prioritizing a little bit more unilateral upper body work. So maybe some dumbbell benching, single or two dumbbells at a time, maybe some overhead pressing. We'll see how it goes. It's not particularly about progressing these lifts or hitting PBs or massive weights in them. It'll just be about doing unilateral work, so practicing the skill of it, just in case there is any kind of underlying imbalance that would cause an issue or anything that would be more than normal.
Other changes you're going to start seeing in Hadyn's training, particularly with the bench press, is we've hit some like significant PBs now, so like 15 or 20 kilos heavier as a kind of training 1RM than we have been using for the last few months. So the relative percentage will stay the same, like the percentages in which he'll be training at, the overall progression scale of his bench training will remain pretty much identical. We'll step up the volume a small bit and step up the kind of the gusto with which we pursue bigger weights. But the actual weights you'll see on the bar will be heavier. So if you think for the last few months we've been using like 130, 140 kilos as a 1RM, we're obviously using 160 or 165 kilos now as a 1RM. So the actual weights you see him lifting from week to week will be significantly higher. This will also start to add into the overall kind of skill that he will gain from the bench press. So obviously bench pressing 160, 165 kilos is a very, very different skill from bench pressing 130 or 140 kilos. So you'll start to see him become much more comfortable with heavier weights and just much more comfortable in terms of like the strength and the speed of his lockout. You'll see certain things like when he's holding the bar just after he unracks it. All of these things will start to get a lot crisper and a lot more dialed in.
So then moving on to the deadlift. So we didn't hit any PBs on the 1RM for the deadlift. So you'll see in the video, Hadyn went for 300 without straps and calibrated. So Hadyn's original PB was 302.5 kilos with straps and bumpers. So for this, we were kind of pushing for comp settings or comp equipment. So we had hook grip, no straps and calibrated plates. So you'll see in the video, Hadyn's hand tears quite aggressively on the way up. So that's something that will be needed to note, and we'll have to pay more attention to that. So it's valuable information from it. So moving forward, we will be changing away that focus, like we said, from this back squat. So we talked about, we put a lot of focus on strengthening his quads and getting that kind of whole system a lot stronger. We can maintain a lot of that strength now and probably still progress it with less work, and we'll put a lot more strength into his hamstring. So you'll see Hadyn's deadlift lockout is quite weak. You'll see a lot of heavier reps and sets, and you can see it really, really obviously, at the top of that sumo deadlift, the 300 kilos. So you'll see he attempts it again with straps, gets to the top, no problem, and then before lockout, he just can't quite lock out. So Hadyn's sumo deadlift is very, very similar to a conventional deadlift compared to, for example, someone like Yuri Balkin or a couple of other sumo deadlifters, where the Steffi Cohen is a great example, where their sumo deadlift is really just a squat from the ground up, whereas Hadyn's is a bit more similar to a conventional style deadlift with a sumo stance. So there's a lot of hamstrings involved, especially in the lockout. So we're going to be focusing on a lot of hamstring work. Whatever work we kind of resources we take away from his quads, we're going to be putting into his hamstrings. So it'll be a lot of hamstring curls. It'll be a lot of isolation work, because we won't murder his hamstrings too much with stuff like RDLs or stiff leg deadlift, for example. They will feature, but there won't be an insane amount of those because they're very, very fatiguing. So we'll just be looking at a lot of like machine curls, banded curls, Nordics, for example, would be great ones. Just really hammer those. We'll make a lot of progress with a lot of lower intensity work. And then in terms of the deadlift programming going forward, we'll probably be looking at, for the next maybe 2 or 3 weeks, just a little bit of variation. So probably pause deadlifts, maybe deficit deadlifts, but more than likely pause deadlifts. We'll see how that goes, just to change it up a little bit from going from sets and reps to the deadlift, and then more of the same. In terms of the progress he'd made in the deadlift, he's 280 for 2 sets of 2 were PBs. They were 2RMs without straps. So one set was with hook grip, one was without. So the deadlift progression is there. It just, that day we some issues. But going forward from that, the deadlift progression, once the variation's over, just to change the stimulus for like 2 weeks, for example, once that's over, we'll get back to the same old progressions and pushing for heavier weights. And then we will, ultimately for deadlifting, you just got to do more deadlifting. We'll be working these weaknesses.
So for those of you who will have watched the video, right, you'll have seen a catastrophic failure of like the skin in his hands. is there something you can do as a coach on the day to ensure that doesn't happen, right? So discrete event on the day. As he was warming up, Hadyn talked about like he felt like his hands were kind of tearing. I think it was around 270. So what do you do in that case, right? Well, when you look at calluses tearing in the hand, most of the time it's a build up. He thought it was just like hardened skin. But what happens when a callus builds up on your hand is you get a lump of hardened skin. So it's a lump of dead skin. Because that lump is there, obviously you increase the amount of shear force that goes into your skin at that point, and where your dead skin meets your live skin, it will just tear off, right? So that's a huge issue. If on the day that starts becoming an issue, or like if in the week leading up to it, it starts becoming an issue, you ensure that those calluses are shaved and that you have a smooth surface where that dead skin interfaces with the live skin that's still on your hand. Other things you can start doing, right? If at your 90% attempt, you get a small little tear in your hand, what we would then recommend for Hadyn to do, and we've talked him through this, is a gluing of the hand. So cyanoacrylate glue, or what most people call like crazy glue or super glue, was originally designed for gluing skin to skin. And what you do is you would go along the seam of your pre-existing callus and make sure that is like reinforced, that you have no weakness there basically. So that's what you do on the day. In terms of over the course of the training cycle and making sure that hand stays good now, first thing you need to start looking at is, okay, is it to do with the shape he's gripping the bar with, right? So he's obviously hook gripping. Why is it happening to one hand more than it's happening to the other? Well, he talks about the hand that's stronger being the one that tears, right? And people often think, okay, that hand is stronger, so it grips the bar more, so that's why I tear the skin. That's probably not really true, right? Probably what's happening there is a mixture of two factors. The first factor is that hand is stronger, so it's probably on a dominant side, so you probably put more force through that hand, and therefore, because there's more force to tear the skin. Also, what happens is, when you have a hand that's stronger, the hand tends to slightly open because you're more confident with it. So if I am very confident of picking up 200 kilos in my right hand, and I know I'm going to be able to hold it, I won't think about kind of death squeezing the bar or being in a very, very good, efficient position with my hand. I'll just think about, okay, I'm definitely going to be able to hold it, and that bar might have gone from this kind of position to a slightly longer position, and I'm elongating that grip. Once I start elongating the grip, that skin that's on the palm of my hand starts just being stretched over the first knuckle of my carpal, and then I start getting that tearing force again. So it's ensuring the shape of the grip and the shape of the hand as he's holding onto the bar is correct. And obviously there's discrete things we can do on the day if the skin does start to fail that will hopefully lead him to lifting much bigger weights than he lifted this time. Other things with the deadlift. So Garth talked about Hadyn's technique not being ideal for sumo. Absolutely, 100%. It's not ideal. Sumo, we'd usually like something to look very similar to a piston, very little deviation in the back angle. He'll basically just want him to stand straight up and possibly some shoulder opening at the top. So what does that look like in terms of faults for Hadyn? Well, Hadyn has two faults besides the back angle thing and the general kind of shape of his sumo deadlift. The first fault is the bar tends to roll away from him on the floor. Obviously, bars rolling away from people in any pull, whether that be a sumo deadlift, conventional deadlift, clean, snatch, whatever it is never efficient, right? So every centimeter we lose there, we're losing possible kilos on the bar because the bar is more out in front of us. So that'll be the first thing, making sure that rolling away from him stops happening completely. And then the second thing, he tends to focus on speed off the floor a bit too much. Particularly in athletes who are struggling with the lockout, the last thing we want to do is dump everything into that initial pulling position. The sumo deadlift should be at its slowest when we're pulling it off the floor. So it should be a squeezing off the floor, and then as that bar starts to move, we can lock it out. That's like, it's kind of opposite of the conventional deadlift in that sense. So it's just watching those things, the rolling way off the floor and the too far out in front of us, will be the main things we'll really be sticking Hadyn on over the course of the next few weeks. So if you have questions about kind of Hadyn's program in general, if you have questions about the things that have been brought up here, or just general comments, we do appreciate them in the comments down below. So pop in anything you want there. If you want to follow this series going forward, right, go to Hadyn's channel, look at the videos he's put up so far. You'll get a different kind of view of this. Like, it's very easy for us to talk about this theoretically, but you'll see the impact that this has on Hadyn over the course of the last few months, and it will have over the course of the next few months. And yeah, if you could like the video, if you could subscribe to the channel, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.